Well, hello, thanks for checking out my channel today. I wanted to talk a little bit about appraisals and the appraisal contingency in the Arizona real estate purchase contract. I've got a few sellers right now that are asking questions about appraisals, and I just thought this would be a good time to kind of go over the basics of what the appraisal contingency is and what that looks like for both the buyer and the seller. So let's get right to it. For a seller, when a buyer comes to you with a purchase agreement to buy the house that has a loan attached to it, a loan contingency, there's also going to be what's called an appraisal contingency. And typically, the appraisal contingency and the appraisal itself will be done following the inspection period. They'll first inspect the property to make sure it's in acceptable condition, and if they decide to negotiate any repairs or concessions with the seller, they'll go ahead and do that during that 10-day period. And then once they've made an agreement and feel comfortable moving forward, typically they'll order the appraisal. And so what does that mean? You know, and what does the contingency say for both the buyer and the seller? What are their rights? From the seller's perspective, they're just hoping, they're counting on the house appraising for at least the contract price. The caveat there is sometimes the house is worth more than the borrower is getting a loan for, but typically the bank will still want to, you know, if they're getting a house for $300,000 and the borrower's putting $100,000 down, then they're obviously only getting a loan for $200,000. So in the bank's eyes, that's a good loan. That's something they're going to do all day, but they're still going to make sure the house is worth what the borrower is paying for, and obviously to at least the tune of what they're going to borrow to their client to buy that house. So that's less of a problem if you're on the seller side. That's less of a concern because you know that's a good loan, and the lender's got low risk in giving that loan. But the buyer, obviously, they're going to want to see that the house appraises for at least what they're paying for in the contract. Even though, you know, the loan's only for $300,000, if they're paying $300,000 for the house, they're going to want to make sure they're getting a fair deal and that the house appraises for at least $300,000. And the way that buyer contingency plays out is, for a buyer, they have within 5 days of receiving the appraisal back, they have to give notice to the seller in a case and provide the appraisal in case the house doesn't appraise. And they have really three main options that they can do. Obviously, if the house appraises, there's no issue. If the house is worth more than what they're paying for, obviously that's a good position for the buyer to be in, and they probably won't ever tell the seller what the house appraised for because they don't really want them to, you know, it doesn't change anything, the fact the seller still has to pay the contractual amount for the house, or the seller still has to agree to sell the house for the amount the buyer's contractually agreed to pay. But if the house doesn't appraise, the buyer typically will ask the seller to make up the shortfall, and we're hoping that that's just a few $1,000s. I've seen some cases back when short sales and foreclosures were a larger percentage of the market where there was actually significant difference, and appraisals were kind of a big gray area because houses were, you know, prices were going up so quickly, they were recovering from all-time lows, and there was really a gray area in what the houses were worth at any given time due to the high number of foreclosure comparables. But anyway, the seller will typically, 9 out of 10 times, if there's a shortfall, the buyer will ask the seller to come down to whatever the appraisal price is. When it's a few $1,000s, usually it's not a big deal. That's something they're going to have to worry about with the next buyer. So they're happy to make that deal, and to keep the deal going forward, they're going to, you know, sign an addendum reducing the price. The other option, though, the buyer could obviously, if they think it's a bad deal, say the house appraises for 10 grand under what under what the seller and the buyer have reached an agreement for, then the buyer might just cancel it, say this is a bad deal, and they give my earnest money back. And as long as they do that within that 5-day period after receiving the appraisal and giving notice to the seller, then they can ask for their earnest money to be refunded without any withholding. So that's why it's called a contingency. The other option is the third option, and that is typically where there might be the middle ground, where the buyer might say you're $10,000 away, or to make it easier, let's just say you're $5,000 off, and the buyer agrees to come up $2,500. If the seller will reduce the price $2,500. So there's always the negotiation part, where one party might give a little and the other one might give a little as well to make the deal work. So again, just to review, the buyer contingency, if the house appraises, great. If the house fails to appraise, there's the three options. There's one that we talked about where the buyer will give notice to the seller. The seller typically will come down to whatever the price the house appraises for to keep the deal going forward. Number two, the buyer might walk away. It's a bad deal. The house is what they've agreed to pay is way higher than what the house is worth in their eyes through the results of the appraisal, so they'll ask the contract to be canceled as long as that's within that 5-day appraisal contingency period. They can do that. And number three is where the buyer and seller negotiate terms, and usually the buyer comes up a little and the seller comes down. But that, that could be that could hash out any number of ways in order to make the deal going forward. You might renegotiate other terms of the contract, like concessions. The buyer might actually decide to come up with the difference in cash. Anyway, for the buyer, those are the three ways that they can handle that appraisal contingency. But you got to remember, the seller has some rights too. If the house fails to appraise for what they're in contract for, in any one of those situations, except obviously the buyer canceling, the seller obviously has a right to say no. They actually can say, no, we've agreed to sell the house at this price, and this is what it's going to be. They might think the appraiser did a bad job or used bad comps. The house is worth this. So they could say no. They're within their right to say no, and what that means is then the buyer can obviously say, well, we're going to cancel. Typically both parties are able to work something out, but in the case the seller draws a hard line and sticks with their number, they can certainly do that, and that's where they can then cancel the deal and go after another buyer. So they can say no and they cancel, and then the buyer's going to cancel the contract probably. So yeah, that's kind of how that plays out. As long as the seller communicates with the buyer and what their response is before that 5-day period's up, they can do that. And but usually the seller is going to try to keep the deal going and gonna make a deal unless they have a backup offer. If it's in a really hot market, they know they can go out and get another buyer fairly quickly, then they might do that. So it obviously just depends. And but again, the buyer has those three options. The seller has the right to say no, and say, well, you guys can either walk away or you can come up with a difference in cash. And for most buyers, to come up with the difference in cash is not too big of a stretch for when we're talking a couple $1,000s, but you'd actually be surprised even when you're a couple $1,000s off, people are so set on a budget, or they're so broke, if you will, they're putting like the least amount down, that they just don't have a couple $1,000s to extra. They're usually putting everything into the deal that they have. They're getting a grant assistance payment from one of the DPA programs, or a gift letter from family, or they're even contributing money to help them do the deal. So it's pretty rare, but buyers do have the option. The seller saying no, they can come up with a difference in cash. Sometimes that works out when the buyer's putting a large amount down, or has a substantial bank account down payment that they're going to use. So anyway, that's an appraisal contingency. I hope that helps you understand how that might work and how that might affect you. If you have any specific questions, just put your comments down below, and be happy to cover a topic that you want covered on the next video. All right, thanks for watching.